In 1692, while Salem burned witches, Boston's most respectable merchants were quietly building America's first organized pleasure districts. What the history books never tell you is that colonial America's economy didn't just run on tobacco and cotton, it ran on secrets that would make modern scandals look like Sunday sermons. The women who built this hidden empire left behind a trail of coded letters, and what they reveal will change everything you thought you knew about America's founding. The dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the attic window when Margaret Chen pulled the leather-bound journal from behind a loose floorboard. It was October 1987, and she was cleaning out her grandmother's Providence home, expecting nothing more than yellowed receipts and forgotten photographs. Instead, she held something that would rewrite 3 centuries of American history. The journal belonged to Martha Hartwell, dated 1692 to 1698. But these weren't the simple daily observations of a colonial housewife. Every page was filled with symbols, numbers, and cryptic abbreviations that looked more like a spy's codebook than a woman's diary. Margaret, a linguistics professor at Brown University, recognized immediately that this was no ordinary colonial document. What she discovered over the next 3 years would shake the foundations of everything historians thought they knew about early America. Martha Hartwell wasn't just any colonial woman. According to the decoded entries, she was the coordinator of what she called the Network, a sophisticated business operation that stretched from Boston's narrow cobblestone streets to Charleston's humid port districts. This wasn't the desperate survival most historians assumed characterized women's lives in colonial America. This was calculated, organized, and incredibly profitable. The first decoded entry read, SS requests expansion to Hartford territory, revenue projections favorable. Madame R. agrees to provide training for 3 candidates, payment secured through usual channels. This wasn't the language of desperation, this was the language of expansion, profit margins, and strategic planning. But the most shocking revelation came in an entry dated March 15, 1694. Martha had written, "Governor's man visited again, assures continued protection in exchange for usual considerations, military contracts to be announced next week. Prepare our sources accordingly." Margaret stared at those words for hours, understanding their implications. The colonial government wasn't just tolerating these operations, they were actively coordinating with them. Each decoded page revealed more disturbing truths. Martha's network wasn't operating in society's shadows, it was operating in its very center. The women she wrote about weren't outcasts or criminals. They were connected to merchant families, religious leaders, and government officials. Some entries suggested that several prominent colonial wives were secretly involved in coordinating these operations, while maintaining their respectable public personas. The journal contained detailed financial records showing revenue streams that would make modern corporate executives envious. Martha tracked seasonal fluctuations, customer preferences, territorial disputes with competing operations, and even early market research. One entry analyzed how the arrival of new ships affected business patterns, demonstrating an understanding of economic cycles that wouldn't be formally studied for another century. But Martha's network was more than just business. The journal revealed an intricate communication system spanning the entire eastern seaboard. Women in her network passed information about everything from crop failures to political scandals, from ship arrivals to family secrets. They knew which merchants were facing bankruptcy before the merchants themselves did. They predicted political appointments weeks before they were announced. They had created America's first intelligence network, and it was run entirely by women. The most disturbing entry came near the journal's end, dated November 3, 1697. Salem taught us the price of visibility, new protocols necessary. Surface operations only. Deep knowledge must remain buried. Future generations will not understand what survival required. Martha knew her world was changing. The witch trials had sent a clear message about what happened to women who accumulated too much power or knowledge. The network would have to evolve or disappear. Margaret realized she wasn't just holding a historical document, she was holding evidence of a deliberate erasure. Martha and women like her had consciously hidden their activities, understanding that future generations would judge them by different moral standards. They had sacrificed their place in history to protect their survival in the present. The final decoded entry was the most haunting. "We were never here, but we built everything they will inherit. Let that be enough." Martha Hartwell had predicted her own historical invisibility, accepting it as the price of her very real power. But the strangest part was what Margaret found when she researched Martha's family lineage. Martha Hartwell had no descendants listed in any official records. Officially, she had never existed. Yet, here was her journal, her thoughts, her detailed business records spanning 6 years. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase not just Martha's story, but Martha herself from the historical record. What they didn't know was that Martha had hidden copies of her most important documents in places they would never think to look. And 3 centuries later, those hidden truths were finally coming to light. The morning sun cast long shadows across Boston Common as Reverend Cotton Mather prepared his Sunday sermon on moral purity. It was March 1695, and Mather had chosen to speak on the evils of temptation that threatened to corrupt God's chosen community. What his congregation didn't know was that the night before, Mather had filled 17 pages of his private journal with a very different kind of confession. "I am tormented by my own hypocrisy," he wrote in Latin, perhaps hoping that God would judge him less harshly in a scholarly tongue. "I preach of purity while my feet know the path to Goody Williams's establishment on Fish Street. I condemn the flesh while my purse grows lighter in service to it." Mather wasn't alone in his internal contradiction. Colonial America had built its identity on moral superiority, yet its economy increasingly depended on the very vices it publicly condemned. The same merchants who funded church construction were secretly financing establishments that would have horrified their congregations. The same magistrates who sentenced adulteresses to public humiliation were regular visitors to houses where discretion was the only sacrament. Samuel Shrimpton, one of Boston's wealthiest merchants and a deacon in his church, maintained meticulous business records that revealed the depth of this hypocrisy. His legitimate shipping manifests showed imports of Bibles, prayer books, and moral treatises from London. His secret ledgers, written in a code he developed with Martha Hartwell's network, showed payments for special cargo and discreet services that had nothing to do with salvation. The psychological toll of maintaining these dual identities was devastating. Shrimpton's private letters to his brother in England reveal a man slowly fragmenting under the weight of his contradictions. "I fear God sees through my public face to the rottenness beneath," he wrote in, "yet I cannot stop. The flesh is weak, but worse. The economics are necessary." This wasn't simple moral failure. It was structural hypocrisy built into the very foundation of colonial society. Puritan doctrine demanded impossible standards of purity, while economic reality required compromises that violated every principle they claimed to hold sacred. The result was a culture that learned compartmentalize to maintain public virtue while privately engaging in behaviors they would publicly condemn in others. The women who provided these services understood this paradox better than the men who created it. Elizabeth Tuttle, who operated what she called a boarding house for gentlemen in Hartford, wrote to Martha Hartwell, "They come to us carrying the weight of their impossible God. We offer them not sin, but the illusion of remaining sinless. We are their confession booth, with softer walls." Church records from the period reveal the true scope of this contradiction. The same sessions that recorded donations for missionary work also recorded, in careful euphemisms, payments for discretionary funds and charitable works of a private nature. Deacons who preached about the dangers of temptation were approving expenditures that directly funded the sources of that temptation. The most revealing document came from Reverend Increase Mather's personal correspondence with other ministers throughout New England. In a letter dated August 1693, he wrote, "We face a spiritual crisis of our own making. We have created a system where righteousness is performed on Sunday and abandoned by Tuesday. Our congregations live in 2 worlds, and I fear God recognizes only one of them." What made this hypocrisy particularly devastating was how it affected the women trapped within it. Respectable Puritan wives knew exactly what their husbands were doing, yet were forbidden from acknowledging it publicly. Sarah Shrimpton, Samuel's wife, left behind a diary that chronicles her growing awareness of her husband's double life. "I pray for his soul while counting the coins that smell of foreign perfume," she wrote. "I am complicit in my silence, yet speech would destroy us both." The children of these families grew up in an atmosphere of carefully maintained lies. They learned early that appearances mattered more than truth, that moral rhetoric was a performance rather than a genuine guide to behavior. This psychological conditioning would shape American character for generations, creating a culture comfortable with the gap between public pronouncements and private actions. Some ministers attempted to address this contradiction directly. Reverend Solomon Stoddard of Northampton, wrote a series of sermons, acknowledging what he called the darkness that feeds on righteousness. But even Stoddard's courage had limits. His sermons spoke in metaphors and biblical allegories, never directly naming the activities that were corrupting his community. The economic implications were staggering. By 1698, what colonial authorities euphemistically called irregular commerce was generating more revenue than legitimate trade in several major cities. Tax collectors, themselves often customers of these establishments, found creative ways to ignore this income stream while ensuring it continued to flow. The colonial economy had become addicted to its own moral contradictions. The witch trials of 1692 suddenly made sense in this context. The hysteria wasn't really about supernatural fears. It was about a community's desperate attempt to purge itself of guilt. It couldn't acknowledge the women accused of witchcraft were often those who had somehow glimpsed the truth behind the community's moral facade. Salem wasn't hunting witches, it was eliminating witnesses. Yet for all their internal torment, these men couldn't break free from the system they had created. The journals of prominent colonial leaders reveal a pattern of guilt, resolution, and inevitable return. They would swear off their secret lives, rededicate themselves to virtue, and within weeks find themselves back at the same establishments, carrying the same burden of shame. No one could explain why an entire society chose to live this massive lie. The answer lay in understanding that colonial America wasn't just building a new nation. It was building a new kind of economy, one that required different rules for different people. The knock came at midnight. Soft but insistent. Elizabeth Tuttle opened her Hartford door to find Mary Prescott standing in the snow, clutching a baby and a single cloth bag. Mary's husband had died of fever 3 weeks earlier, leaving her with 2 children and debts that exceeded the value of everything they owned. Under colonial law, she had no right to inherit his business, no legal means of supporting her family, and no recourse but charity or starvation. "I've heard you help women like me," Mary whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Elizabeth nodded and stepped aside. Within 6 months, Mary would transform from a desperate widow into one of the most successful businesswomen in Connecticut, though no official record would ever acknowledge her accomplishments. Mary's story wasn't unique. Colonial America had created an economic system that offered women virtually no legitimate paths to financial independence. Widows could inherit property, but rarely businesses. Single women could work as servants or seamstresses for subsistence wages. Divorced women, a nearly impossible legal status to achieve, had no rights at all. Yet these same legal restrictions created a massive economic opportunity that brilliant women like Elizabeth Tuttle had learned to exploit. Elizabeth had arrived in Hartford in 1689 as an indentured servant, sold to pay her father's gambling debts in London. A contract bound her to 7 years of unpaid labor. But Elizabeth understood that knowledge was more valuable than time. She watched how her master's household operated, learned who held real power in the community, and most importantly, identified what services the community needed, but couldn't publicly acknowledge. When her indenture ended in 1696, Elizabeth didn't seek employment with another family. Instead, she used her savings to purchase a modest house on the edge of town, and advertised herself as a boarding house keeper for traveling merchants. What she actually created was something far more sophisticated, a private club where Hartford's most powerful men could escape the impossible moral standards of Puritan society. The genius of Elizabeth's model lay in its apparent respectability. Her establishment looked exactly like dozens of other boarding houses throughout colonial America. Travelers stayed there, meals were served at communal tables, and everyone observed proper moral decorum in public spaces. But Elizabeth had designed her house with private parlors, discreet entrances, and soundproof walls that allowed for very different activities in private. Within 2 years, Elizabeth's boarding house was generating more revenue than Hartford's largest legitimate businesses. Her account books, written in a cipher she learned from Martha Hartwell's network, showed weekly profits that exceeded what most colonial families earned in a year. She employed 12 women, provided housing and education for their children, and had created the first workplace in Connecticut where women received equal pay for equal work. The women Elizabeth employed weren't desperate victims. They were carefully selected entrepreneurs who understood they were building something unprecedented. Sarah Williams had been trained as an apothecary, but couldn't practice legally because she was unmarried. Under Elizabeth's roof, Sarah provided medical services that the community desperately needed, but couldn't acknowledge. Margaret Chen had learned bookkeeping from her merchant father but couldn't inherit his business because of her gender. In Elizabeth's establishment, Margaret managed financial operations that would have impressed London bankers. Each woman in the network developed specialized skills that went far beyond the obvious services. They became expert readers of human psychology, master negotiators, and sophisticated information analysts. They understood market forces, supply and demand, customer relations, and business expansion in ways that Harvard College wasn't even teaching its male students. The economic impact extended far beyond individual success stories. Elizabeth's network created employment for seamstresses who made specialized clothing, carpenters who built discrete modifications to buildings, and merchants who imported luxury goods that weren't available through conventional channels. They stimulated local agriculture by purchasing higher quality food than typical boarding houses served. They even employed teachers to educate the children of women in the network, creating the first private schools in several colonial communities. Most remarkably, these women had created the first consumer credit system in colonial America. Elizabeth's records show sophisticated lending arrangements where established women in the network provided startup capital for newcomers, complete with interest calculations and repayment schedules. They had invented business concepts that wouldn't appear in economic textbooks for another century. The network's financial sophistication became apparent in how they handled taxation. Colonial tax collectors, themselves often customers, faced an impossible dilemma. These establishments were clearly generating substantial revenue, but acknowledging that revenue would require explaining its source. The solution was an elaborate system of fictional businesses and creative accounting that satisfied everyone's need to maintain appearances while ensuring tax obligations were met. By 1700, Elizabeth's model had been replicated in every major colonial city. The cumulative economic impact was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that these networks were generating more revenue than the Atlantic slave trade, making them one of colonial America's largest industries. Yet, because these businesses operated outside official recognition, their contributions never appeared in any economic calculations. The human cost of this exclusion was immense. Women like Elizabeth Tuttle were building the foundation of American capitalism, but they could never claim credit for their innovations. They were creating jobs, stimulating economic growth, and developing business practices that would shape American commerce for centuries, yet they remained invisible in every official record. The most heartbreaking aspect was how this system affected their children. Elizabeth raised 3 daughters who were more financially literate than most colonial merchants. But they could never acknowledge how they had learned these skills. They understood complex economic principles but had to pretend ignorance in public. They had inherited substantial wealth, but couldn't explain its source without destroying their social standing. What colonial authorities didn't understand was that by denying women legitimate economic opportunities, they had inadvertently created an alternative economy that operated by different rules and generated enormous wealth. The women in these networks weren't victims of economic oppression. They were its most successful survivors. The real power wasn't in the money they earned, but in the secrets they accumulated while earning it. The coded letter arrived in Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in April 1697, hidden inside a shipment of fabric from Boston. To anyone examining the cargo, it appeared to be a simple invoice listing yards of silk and cotton, but when Madame Rosette held the paper over a candle flame, invisible ink revealed a very different message. Governor announces military contracts Thursday. Recommend immediate contact with Colonel Matthews. His preference is well documented, usual arrangement. This wasn't just business correspondence. It was intelligence gathering that would have impressed European spy networks. The women operating these establishments had discovered that men revealed their most closely guarded secrets in moments of vulnerability. Political plans, military strategies, business dealings, family scandals, everything flowed through these networks like water through carefully designed channels. Madame Rosette, whose real name was Rebecca Morrison, had arrived in Philadelphia in 1693 as the widow of a failed tobacco merchant. Within 4 years, she had built an information network that extended from Portsmouth to Savannah, employing over 60 women in positions that modern intelligence agencies would call human sources. These women didn't just provide services. They gathered, analyzed, and distributed information that influenced colonial politics at the highest levels. The sophistication of their communication system was remarkable. Each establishment used different coding methods, invisible inks, and dead drops to pass information. They had developed a standardized vocabulary, where silk shipments referred to political intelligence, Cotton deliveries meant military information, and fabric quality indicated the reliability of sources. A typical message might read, "Recent silk shipment from Boston, excellent quality. Cotton delivery expected Thursday. Recommend immediate inspection of fabric before competitors arrive." The network's influence became apparent during King William's War, when colonial authorities struggled to coordinate military strategies across different provinces, while official diplomatic channels moved slowly and often carried compromised information. Rebecca's network was providing real-time intelligence that affected battle outcomes. A message sent from her Philadelphia establishment to Martha Hartwell in Boston traveled faster and contained more accurate information than official military dispatches. The women had identified a crucial weakness in colonial society. Powerful men compartmentalized their lives so completely that they forgot information shared in private could have public consequences. Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York regularly discussed military strategy during his visits to Rebecca's establishment, apparently believing that his conversations were meaningless pillow talk. In reality, every detail was recorded, coded, and transmitted to women throughout the network, who used this information to protect their own operations and influence local politics. The network's political influence reached its peak during the Salem witch trials. While historians have long wondered how accusations spread so quickly across different communities, Rebecca's coded correspondence provides the answer. The women in the network were tracking the trials in real time, identifying patterns in accusations, and warning their associates when danger approached their areas. They had created an early warning system that allowed many women to escape prosecution by relocating or altering their activities before suspicion fell on them. More disturbing was the network's role in influencing who got accused. Rebecca's letters contain explicit references to using accusations of witchcraft to eliminate business competitors or silence women who possessed dangerous information. "Margaret Henderson grows troublesome," one message read. "Recommend immediate attention to her unusual behavior and suspected supernatural activities." 3 weeks later, Margaret Henderson was arrested for witchcraft and executed. The network's information-gathering capabilities extended beyond political and military intelligence. They maintained detailed records on the financial status of prominent families, the legitimacy of various marriages, inheritance disputes, and business partnerships that weren't public knowledge. This information made them incredibly valuable to anyone seeking to advance their interests or protect themselves from scandal. Rebecca's establishment became the unofficial intelligence headquarters for Pennsylvania, processing information that influenced everything from land grants to judicial appointments. Colonial officials who needed to understand public opinion or gather intelligence on their political rivals found that Rebecca's women had access to information that no official network could provide. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Officials received valuable intelligence, while the network received protection from prosecution and harassment. The coding systems they developed were remarkably sophisticated. Different establishments used different methods, ranging from simple letter substitution to complex mathematical ciphers that wouldn't be broken for centuries. They employed invisible inks made from various plant extracts, used steganography to hide messages within apparently innocent documents, and developed verbal codes that allowed face-to-face communication without risk of eavesdropping. The most ingenious aspect of their intelligence network was how they verified information. Each piece of intelligence was confirmed through multiple sources before being acted upon or transmitted. They had developed fact-checking protocols that ensured accuracy and prevented the spread of false information that could damage their credibility or endanger their operations. Their intelligence was more reliable than official government communications because their survival depended on its accuracy. The network's influence on colonial politics was so extensive that several major political decisions can be traced directly to information gathered in these establishments. The appointment of certain colonial governors, the timing of various military campaigns, and even some territorial boundary negotiations were influenced by intelligence that flowed through Rebecca's network. What made their intelligence network particularly dangerous to colonial authorities was its independence. Unlike official intelligence gathering, which served specific political interests, the women's network served its own survival and prosperity. They would sell information to anyone who could pay for it and protect it, making them simultaneously valuable and threatening to every power structure in colonial society. The network's most closely guarded secret was the identity of their highest-level sources. Rebecca's coded correspondence contains references to informants she calls the governor's friend, the minister's confidant, and the admiral's companion. These weren't casual customers. They were ongoing intelligence relationships with some of the most powerful men in colonial America. But the most protected secret was how deep into colonial government their intelligence network actually reached. And what they discovered about corruption in the highest levels of colonial administration would have destroyed the legitimacy of British rule in America decades before the Revolution began. The order came sealed with the governor's personal signet, dated December 15, 1702. All records pertaining to irregular commercial activities within the province are to be reviewed and edited for historical propriety. Future generations must inherit a moral foundation worthy of God's chosen people. What followed was the most systematic destruction of historical evidence in early American history. Thomas Hutchinson, appointed as Massachusetts's first official historian, understood his real assignment. His job wasn't to record history, it was to rewrite it. Over the next 2 decades, Hutchinson supervised the editing, alteration, and outright destruction of thousands of documents that contradicted the official narrative of Puritan moral superiority. Town records, court proceedings, tax assessments, and private correspondence all underwent what he euphemistically called moral clarification. The Erasure campaign wasn't limited to Massachusetts. Every colony embarked on similar projects, coordinated through unofficial channels to ensure consistency in the emerging historical narrative. Prominent families paid substantial sums to have embarrassing ancestors removed from official records. Churches rewrote their founding documents to eliminate references to members who had engaged in questionable activities. Even gravestones were altered or replaced to conform to more respectable family histories. The Hartwell family's experience exemplified the thoroughness of this historical cleansing. Martha Hartwell's name was systematically removed from every official record in Providence. Her property transfers were attributed to male relatives who had never existed. Her tax payments were reassigned to fictional businesses. Her correspondence with other women in the network was burned in carefully supervised bonfires that colonial authorities described as cleansing fires of moral purification. But the erasure went beyond simply removing names and references. Entire categories of economic activity disappeared from historical records. Colonial tax assessments from the period show mysterious gaps where substantial revenue sources simply vanished from official accounts. Trade statistics were adjusted to eliminate evidence of commerce that couldn't be acknowledged. Population records were modified to hide the existence of establishments that officially never existed. The most disturbing aspect of the Erasure campaign was how it affected the women who had survived the network's collapse. Women like Elizabeth Tuttle found themselves transformed from successful businesswomen into historical non-entities. Their property was transferred to male relatives through legal fictions. Their business achievements were attributed to men who had played no role in creating them. Their innovations in commerce, finance, and organization simply vanished from the historical record. Sarah Whitman, who had operated one of Newport's most successful establishments and employed over 20 women, found herself reclassified as a spinster of modest circumstances in official records. Her substantial property holdings were attributed to inheritance from a fictional brother. Her business partnerships were rewritten as charitable donations from benevolent male benefactors. Her role in financing several colonial trading ventures was completely eliminated from historical accounts. The campaign's reach extended beyond obvious targets. Women who had been customers, business partners, or simply friends of those in the network found their own histories altered. Respectable colonial wives who had invested money earned through the network saw their family financial records rewritten to show inheritance from fictional relatives. Daughters who had received education funded by network profits found their school attendance attributed to charitable donations from anonymous benefactors. Churches played a crucial role in the historical revision. Congregation records were systematically edited to remove references to members who had been connected to the networks. Baptismal records were altered to hide the identities of children born to women in the establishments. Marriage records were modified to create fictional family histories that eliminated inconvenient connections. Even funeral records were changed to ensure that problematic individuals were buried in historical anonymity. The legal system participated enthusiastically in the erasure. Court records from the period show thousands of cases that were either sealed or destroyed entirely. Wills and estate settlements were rewritten to hide the sources of substantial inheritances. Property transfer documents were backdated and altered to create fictional ownership histories. Even criminal records were modified to eliminate evidence of the network's existence. The most sophisticated aspect of the Erasure campaign was how it created false documentation to replace destroyed evidence. Colonial authorities didn't simply remove inconvenient records. They created elaborate fictional narratives to fill the gaps. Fake business ledgers showed respectable trade relationships, where network operations had actually existed. Fictional correspondence was inserted into family archives to support revised family histories. Even fake journals were created and aged to provide evidence for the sanitized stories. Private families invested enormous resources in rewriting their own histories. The Shrimpton family spent over 3 years and substantial financial resources having their records professionally altered. Samuel Shrimpton's business correspondence was entirely rewritten to eliminate references to his involvement with Martha Hartwell's network. His personal diary was replaced with a fictional version that portrayed him as a model of Puritan virtue. Even his wife's diary was altered to remove her references to his double life. The campaign's success was so complete that by 1730 most colonists genuinely believed the sanitized version of their history. The generation that had lived through the network era was dying off, and their children had been raised on revised family histories that bore no resemblance to reality. Colonial society had successfully gaslit itself into forgetting its own past. Educational institutions played a crucial role in perpetuating the revised history. Harvard College developed curricula that taught the sanitized version of colonial history as absolute truth. Ministers preached sermons that reinforced the fictional narrative of moral superiority. Legal scholars wrote treatises that cited the false documentation as authentic historical sources. The psychological impact on surviving network participants was devastating. Women who had been successful entrepreneurs found themselves written out of existence. They couldn't share their achievements with their children without revealing information that would destroy their family's social standing. They had to watch as their innovations were attributed to men who had never understood the businesses they had built. Yet despite the campaign's thoroughness, complete erasure proved impossible. Some records survived in unexpected places, waiting centuries for historians brave enough to question the official narrative. Hidden chambers in colonial buildings contained documents that had escaped the purges. Private family archives held letters that had been overlooked during the systematic destruction. Even some official records contained coding errors that preserved fragments of forbidden information. The most ironic aspect of the erasure campaign was that it preserved evidence of its own existence. The very documents authorizing the destruction of historical records became historical records themselves, providing future historians with proof of the systematic falsification of American colonial history. But the hidden records that survived would eventually reveal something even more shocking than the existence of the networks themselves. They would reveal just how deep the corruption went in colonial government, and how the networks had documented every illegal transaction. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she held the ultraviolet lamp over the seemingly blank page from Martha Hartwell's journal. It was November 1992, and she had been working for 3 years to decode the mysterious symbols that filled the Providence document. As the invisible ink slowly materialized under the purple light, revealing hidden text beneath the visible writing, Sarah realized she was looking at the most sophisticated information management system in colonial American history. The breakthrough had come through accident rather than intention. Sarah, a cryptography professor at MIT, had been consulting on the authentication of colonial documents when Margaret Chen brought her grandmother's mysterious journal to the university. What initially appeared to be decorative flourishes in the margins were actually mathematical nations that corresponded to a complex substitution cipher. The invisible ink revelation transformed what had seemed like random notes into a comprehensive intelligence database. The coding system Martha had developed was generations ahead of its time. She used multiple layers of encryption, visible text that appeared to be innocent household observations, invisible ink that revealed the true content, and numerical codes that referenced specific individuals, locations, and activities. A typical entry might appear to discuss fabric purchases while actually documenting political intelligence, financial transactions, and personal information about colonial leaders. Sarah's team discovered that Martha had created what amounted to a colonial-era database management system. Names were reduced to numerical codes that corresponded to detailed profile cards hidden throughout the journal. Activities were classified using botanical references that only someone with access to Martha's key could understand. Dates were disguised using astronomical observations that required knowledge of colonial almanacs to decode properly. The decoding process revealed the extraordinary scope of Martha's information network. She maintained detailed records on over 300 individuals, including colonial governors, religious leaders, military commanders, merchants, and their family members. Each profile contained information about personal preferences, political opinions, business dealings, family secrets, and psychological weaknesses that could be exploited for various purposes. What emerged from the decoded documents was evidence of systematic intelligence gathering that would have impressed modern espionage agencies. Martha's network had infiltrated every level of colonial society, from servant girls in prominent households to women who attended social gatherings of the political elite. They had created a comprehensive surveillance system that monitored the private lives of colonial America's most powerful individuals. The financial records were equally sophisticated. Martha had developed double-entry bookkeeping decades before it became standard practice in American commerce. She tracked revenue streams, operational expenses, employee compensation, and investment opportunities with precision that rivaled London banking houses. Her profit and loss calculations included variables like seasonal fluctuations, military conflicts, and political changes that affected business operations. More disturbing were the blackmail records that emerged from the decoded documents. Martha's network wasn't just gathering information for business purposes. They were systematically documenting illegal activities, corrupt practices, and personal scandals that could be used to ensure protection and cooperation from colonial authorities. They had created a mutually assured destruction system that protected their operations by threatening the reputations and careers of their most powerful customers. The decoded correspondence revealed how the network influenced major colonial events. Martha's letters to Rebecca Morrison in Philadelphia contained detailed discussions of how information gathered in their establishments was being used to manipulate political appointments, military decisions, and economic policies. They weren't just witnesses to colonial history, they were active participants in shaping it. Sarah's team discovered that the network had developed standardized protocols for intelligence gathering, analysis, and distribution. They had created training materials for new recruits that covered everything from extracting information during conversations, to recognizing valuable intelligence, to maintaining operational security. They had essentially created America's first intelligence training academy decades before the Revolution. The psychological profiles contained in Martha's records demonstrated an understanding of human behavior that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries. She had developed techniques for identifying personality types, predicting behavior patterns, and manipulating individuals based on their psychological weaknesses. Her character assessments were more sophisticated than anything produced by colonial colleges or religious institutions. Most remarkably, the decoded documents revealed that Martha's network had predicted many of the political changes that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. They had identified growing tensions between colonial and British interests, documented evidence of corruption in colonial government, and analyzed the economic forces that were driving political opposition to British rule. Their intelligence assessments were more accurate than official government analysis. The decoding process also revealed the network's role in social engineering. They had deliberately influenced colonial society by spreading information that served their interests, suppressing information that threatened their operations, and manipulating public opinion through carefully planted rumors and revelations. They had understood that information was power decades before anyone formally articulated that concept. Sarah's discovery of Martha's coding system led to breakthroughs in decoding other colonial documents. Similar encryption methods were found in documents throughout New England, suggesting that Martha's techniques had been shared throughout the network. Each decoded document revealed new layers of colonial society that had been hidden for centuries. The decoded intelligence reports contained information that challenged fundamental assumptions about colonial history. They revealed that several colonial governors were essentially puppets controlled by British commercial interests, that many religious leaders were engaged in activities that contradicted their public teachings, and that the economic foundation of colonial society was far more corrupt than anyone had imagined. But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah's team decoded a series of messages from 1698 that detailed systematic vote buying, jury tampering, and judicial corruption at every level of colonial government. Martha's network hadn't just documented corruption, they had been active participants in it, using their intelligence to influence legal outcomes and political decisions. The final breakthrough came when Sarah realized that Martha's coding system contained references to other hidden archives. The network had created multiple backup systems, with coded references to hidden documents stored in locations throughout colonial America. Martha's journal wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a map to other hidden archives that contained even more damning evidence. What those archives would reveal about colonial government corruption would make Martha's intelligence network look like amateur surveillance compared to the systematic criminal enterprise that was running colonial America. The coded Treasury record was buried on page 24/7 of Massachusetts Bay Colony's official ledger for 1694, disguised as routine military expenditures. To colonial auditors, it appeared to be a standard payment for provisions and supplies for frontier defense. But when Dr. Sarah Mitchell applied Martha Hartwell's decoding system to the numbers, a very different transaction emerged. Payment to MH Network for intelligence services regarding French military movements. Amount £500. Authorization, Governor W.P. Personal Seal. Governor William Phipps wasn't just a customer of Martha Hartwell's network, he was a business partner. The decoded documents revealed a systematic relationship where Phipps used colonial government funds to pay for intelligence services that officially didn't exist. More disturbing, the intelligence he purchased wasn't being used for colonial defense, it was being used to advance his personal business interests and political ambitions. The relationship had begun during King William's War, when Phipps desperately needed accurate intelligence about French military plans. Official British intelligence networks were slow, unreliable, and often compromised by double agents. Martha's network, however, had sources throughout New France who could provide real-time information about troop movements, supply shortages, and strategic planning. The intelligence they provided allowed Phipps to achieve military victories that made his reputation and secured his political position. But the military intelligence was just the beginning. Phipps quickly realized that Martha's network could provide information that was far more valuable than battlefield reports. They could tell him which Boston merchants were planning to challenge his authority, which religious leaders were plotting against his administration, and which colonial officials were secretly reporting to London about his activities. They had given him eyes and ears throughout colonial society. The coded Treasury records revealed the systematic nature of their relationship. Phipps made regular payments to the network, disguised as everything from military supplies to charitable donations to infrastructure improvements. The amounts were substantial in some months. Payments to Martha's network exceeded the colony's expenditures on legitimate military operations. Colonial taxpayers were unknowingly funding an intelligence network that served the governor's personal interests rather than public security. The political implications were staggering. Phipps used information from the network to outmaneuver his political rivals, eliminate threats to his authority, and advance his supporters to key positions throughout colonial government. Several political appointments that historians had attributed to merit were actually the result of intelligence that revealed embarrassing secrets about competing candidates. Phipps wasn't governing through democratic processes, he was governing through blackmail. The network's influence on military strategy during King William's War was more extensive than anyone had realized. Martha's correspondence with Rebecca Morrison contained detailed discussions of how information gathered from French officers was being used to plan colonial military operations. The network had essentially become an unofficial intelligence agency that operated parallel to official military channels, and often provided superior information. More disturbing was evidence that Phipps had used the network to eliminate political threats through judicial manipulation. The coded records contained references to providing information that led to criminal charges against several of Phipps's political enemies. The network would gather evidence of illegal activities, pass it to Phipps, who would then ensure that sympathetic magistrates pursued prosecution. Several prominent colonists who opposed Phipps's policies found themselves facing criminal charges based on evidence that had been gathered through intimate surveillance. The financial corruption was equally extensive. Phipps used intelligence from the network to manipulate colonial trade policies for his personal benefit. He would receive advance information about which merchants were planning major trading ventures, then use his official authority to create regulatory obstacles for his competitors, while facilitating his own business interests. The network had essentially given him insider information that allowed him to dominate colonial commerce. The most shocking revelation was how Phipps had used the network during the Salem witch trials. The coded documents revealed that he had received detailed intelligence about which accusations were genuine popular hysteria and which were being orchestrated by political rivals to eliminate his supporters. He used this information to selectively intervene in trials, protecting valuable allies while allowing enemies to be destroyed by the accusations. The network's intelligence had revealed that several of the Salem accusations were politically motivated attempts to eliminate women who possessed damaging information about prominent colonial leaders. Phipps knew this, but allowed the prosecutions to proceed because they served his political interests. The Salem trials weren't just mass hysteria, They were partially orchestrated political persecution with the gunner's knowledge and tacit consent. The relationship between Phipps and the network extended beyond simple business transactions. The coded correspondence revealed that Phipps had essentially become dependent on their intelligence for his political survival. He couldn't make major decisions without consulting Martha's assessments of public opinion, political risks, and potential opposition. The network had become his unofficial cabinet, advising him on everything from military strategy to economic policy. The documents also revealed how other colonial governors had developed similar relationships with intelligence networks in their territories. Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York maintained regular contact with Rebecca Morrison's Philadelphia operation. Governor Francis Nicholson of Virginia had established connections with similar networks throughout the Chesapeake region. The practice had become systematic throughout colonial America. What made these relationships particularly dangerous was their complete lack of oversight. Colonial assemblies had no knowledge of these expenditures. British authorities weren't informed about these intelligence operations, and colonists had no idea that their taxes were funding networks that often worked against their interests. The governors had created shadow governments that operated entirely outside legal authority. The coded records contained evidence that these intelligence networks had influenced major colonial policies. Trade regulations, military strategies, judicial appointments, and even territorial negotiations had been shaped by information gathered through intimate surveillance. Colonial government wasn't operating according to legal principles or democratic processes. It was operating according to intelligence gathered through methods that colonists would have found morally reprehensible. The most damning evidence was how these relationships had corrupted the entire colonial justice system. Governors used network intelligence to manipulate trials, influence juries, and ensure favorable legal outcomes for their allies. Justice in colonial America wasn't based on law or evidence. It was based on what information the intelligence networks could provide about judges, juries, and defendants. But the relationship between colonial governors and these intelligence networks was just the surface of a much deeper corruption. The networks had documented evidence that the corruption extended all the way to British colonial administration in London, and what they had recorded would have destroyed the legitimacy of British rule in America. The message arrived in Charleston on a humid August morning in 1695, hidden inside a shipment of rice from a plantation outside the city. To anyone examining the cargo, the small cloth bundle appeared to be a sample of fabric for a seamstress, but when Delilah Washington unfolded the material, she found a coded map and detailed instructions for moving 3 people north to Philadelphia within the next 2 weeks. Delilah wasn't just operating a successful establishment in Charleston, she was coordinating the most sophisticated human transportation network in colonial America. 50 years before the Underground Railroad became legendary, these women had created a system for moving people secretly across colonial territories that operated with efficiency and security that wouldn't be matched until the abolitionist movement of the 1840s. The network's origins lay in practical necessity. Women in the establishments regularly encountered people desperate to escape impossible situations, runaway indentured servants fleeing brutal masters, enslaved people seeking freedom, wives escaping violent husbands, and young women avoiding forced marriages. The network had begun as informal assistance, but evolved into a sophisticated operation that moved hundreds of people annually throughout colonial America. Martha Hartwell's coded records revealed the operational complexity of what she called the traveling service. The network maintained safe houses in every major colonial city, employed scouts who identified safe routes and dangerous obstacles, and had developed communication systems that could coordinate movements across thousands of miles. They had created detailed protocols for different types of transportation needs, and maintained financial resources to support extended journeys. The system's sophistication became apparent in how they handled documentation. Colonial America required various forms of identification and authorization for travel, but the network had developed relationships with clerks, magistrates, and officials throughout the colonies who could provide legitimate papers for people who officially didn't exist. They had essentially created a parallel documentation system that allowed people to acquire new identities and legal status. Delilah's Charleston operation was particularly important, because it served as the primary gateway for people escaping the brutal plantation system of South Carolina and Georgia. Her coded correspondence with Martha Hartwell contained detailed discussions of routes that avoided slave patrols, timing that coordinated with ship departures, and safe houses that could provide temporary shelter during extended journeys north. The network's most remarkable achievement was developing the first systematically integrated operation in colonial America. While official colonial society maintained strict racial segregations, the transportation network operated according to purely practical principles. White indentured servants, free blacks, enslaved people, and Native Americans all used the same routes, stayed in the same safe houses, and received assistance from the same network of operators. The coded records revealed that the network had developed specialized expertise for different types of escapes. They maintained detailed information about which ship captains could be trusted to provide passage without asking questions, which magistrates would issue travel documents for appropriate payments, and which communities had populations sympathetic to people fleeing various forms of oppression. The financial operation was equally sophisticated. The network maintained funds to support people during their journeys, but they also developed systems for people to work off their transportation costs once they reached their destinations. They had created employment networks in northern cities that could provide jobs for refugees, and they maintained connections with communities that welcomed new residents without asking uncomfortable questions about their backgrounds. Rebecca Morrison's Philadelphia operation served as the primary hub for people traveling to New York, New England, or Pennsylvania's frontier regions. Her establishment was designed with hidden rooms, secret passages, and disguised entrances that could accommodate people who needed to remain invisible while arrangements were being made for the next stage of their journeys. The network's most dangerous operations involved moving enslaved people from southern plantations to free territories. This required exceptional coordination between multiple operators, precise timing to avoid slave patrols, and backup plans for situations where primary routes became compromised. The coded correspondence contained detailed discussions of seasonal patterns that affected patrol schedules, political changes that created opportunities or dangers, and community events that could provide cover for clandestine movements. The psychological support the network provided was as important as the physical transportation. Many people using their services had experienced severe trauma and needed emotional recovery as well as physical relocation. The women operating the network had developed informal counseling techniques that helped refugees process their experiences and prepare for new lives in unfamiliar communities. The network's intelligence-gathering capabilities were crucial to their transportation operations. They maintained detailed information about law enforcement activities, patrol schedules, political changes that affected travel restrictions, and community attitudes in different regions. They could predict where dangers were likely to emerge and adjust their operations accordingly. The coded records revealed that the network had developed relationships with Native American communities that provided additional transportation routes and safe havens. Several tribal communities had agreed to assist refugees in exchange for information about colonial military activities and trade opportunities. This created transportation corridors that existed entirely outside colonial legal authority. The network's most impressive achievement was their success rate. Martha's records suggested that over 90% of people who entered their transportation system successfully reached their intended destinations. This success rate was achieved despite the enormous legal risks involved and the limited communication technologies available in colonial America. The social impact of their operations extended far beyond individual rescue stories. The network had created the first systematic challenge to colonial America's various forms of forced labor. They were undermining the economic foundation of plantation agriculture, reducing the effectiveness of indentured servitude, and providing alternatives for people trapped in legally sanctioned oppression. The network's operations also revealed the hypocrisy of colonial legal systems. Many of the same officials who publicly supported laws restricting movement and maintaining forced labor were secretly accepting payments to provide documentation and assistance for people escaping those same systems. The network had documented systematic corruption that extended throughout colonial law enforcement. But the most significant long-term impact was cultural. The network had demonstrated that interracial cooperation was not only possible, but could be highly effective when organized around shared practical goals. They had created integrated communities decades before such integration was considered politically possible, and they had proven that racial barriers could be overcome when survival depended on cooperation. The coded records also revealed that the network had documented extensive evidence of abuse, corruption, and illegal activities throughout colonial society. They had created detailed records of everything they had witnessed, everyone they had helped, and every official who had participated in their operations. This documentation would eventually become crucial evidence for understanding the true nature of colonial American society. However, their most dangerous secret wasn't the transportation network itself. It was what they had learned about colonial society while operating it, and how that knowledge connected to corruption at the highest levels of British colonial administration. The basement beneath 42 Fish Street in Boston looked like a typical colonial storage cellar. Stone walls, wooden shelves, lined with preserved foods, and the musty smell of root vegetables aging through the long New England winter. But when restoration workers examined the space in 1987, they discovered something that shouldn't have existed. A hidden room, accessible only through a concealed door that required knowledge of a specific sequence of brick manipulations to open. Inside the hidden chamber, archaeologists found the physical evidence of Martha Hartwell's network that had been missing from all historical records. The room contained coded ledgers, correspondence with women throughout the colonies, detailed maps of safe houses and transportation routes, and most remarkably, architectural drawings that revealed a standardized design system for creating hidden spaces within apparently normal colonial buildings. The architectural drawings revealed that the network had developed sophisticated engineering solutions for their operational needs. Buildings were designed with hidden rooms accessible through concealed entrances, soundproof chambers for sensitive conversations, observation points that allowed discreet monitoring of public areas, and escape routes that could be used during emergencies. The designs were so clever that these features remained undetected for 3 centuries. Dr. James Morrison, the architectural historian who analyzed the Boston discovery, realized that similar design elements appeared in colonial buildings throughout New England. The Boston pattern, as he called it, included specific proportional relationships that created dead spaces between walls, foundation designs that accommodated hidden chambers, and roofline modifications that disguised ventilation systems for concealed rooms. The architectural evidence suggested that Martha's network had employed professional builders who specialized in creating these hidden features. The quality of construction, the sophistication of the concealment mechanisms, and the consistency of design elements across different buildings indicated that this wasn't amateur carpentry. Someone with advanced engineering knowledge had developed standardized solutions for the network's architectural needs. Archaeological investigation of other colonial sites began revealing the true extent of this hidden architecture. In Philadelphia, ground-penetrating radar identified concealed chambers beneath Rebecca Morrison's former establishment. In Charleston, restoration of a colonial mansion revealed hidden passages that connected different buildings through underground tunnels. In Newport, excavation of a colonial foundation uncovered a sophisticated tunnel system that provided access to the harbor without using public streets. The most remarkable discovery came during the restoration of a colonial mansion in Providence, Rhode Island. Behind a false wall in what appeared to be a standard colonial parlor, archaeologists found a room that had been sealed since the early 18th century. The room contained furniture, clothing, documents and personal belongings that provided unprecedented insight into how the network actually operated. The sealed room had been designed as a safe house for people using the network's transportation services. It contained multiple beds, a small kitchen area, storage space for supplies, and most importantly, a sophisticated communication system that connected to other rooms in the building through speaking tubes hidden within the walls. The network had created technology that allowed secure communication throughout their buildings without risk of eavesdropping. The architectural analysis revealed that these design features weren't randomly distributed throughout colonial America. They appeared most frequently in buildings owned by women who were documented members of the network, in structures located along known transportation routes, and in properties that were positioned to provide strategic advantages for intelligence gathering or business operations. The building designs also revealed the network's understanding of human psychology and behavior. Hidden observation points were positioned to monitor both public areas and private spaces. Room layouts were designed to encourage conversation while allowing operators to gather information without appearing to eavesdrop. Even furniture arrangements were calculated to create psychological comfort that encouraged visitors to reveal more information than they intended. The ventilation systems in these buildings were particularly sophisticated. The network had developed methods for ensuring air circulation in hidden chambers, without creating obvious external vents that might reveal their existence. They had used natural airflow patterns, concealed chimneys, and even underground air channels to solve engineering problems that weren't formally studied until the 19th century. The acoustic engineering was equally impressive. The network had designed their buildings to control sound transmission in ways that protected their operations while allowing them to gather intelligence. They had created soundproof chambers for sensitive conversations, amplification systems that allowed monitoring of conversations in other rooms, and acoustic barriers that prevented external eavesdropping on internal activities. The most disturbing architectural discovery was evidence that some of these hidden features had been incorporated into public buildings. Colonial churches, government buildings, and even judicial structures contained design elements that matched the network's architectural patterns. The implications were staggering. The network hadn't just hidden within colonial society, they had infiltrated its most important institutions. Archaeological evidence from the Massachusetts State House revealed hidden chambers that corresponded to the network's architectural patterns. Similar features were found in the Colonial Courthouse in Philadelphia and the Governor's Mansion in New York. The network had gained physical access to the most sensitive locations in colonial government, allowing them to gather intelligence through direct surveillance of official activities. The standardization of these architectural features suggested that the network had developed professional training programs for builders and craftsmen. The consistency of design elements across different regions and time periods indicated that knowledge was being systematically transmitted through the network rather than developed independently in different locations. The architectural evidence also revealed the network's long-term planning capabilities. Many of the hidden features were designed to remain functional for decades, suggesting that the women building these structures understood they were creating infrastructure for extended operations. They weren't just solving immediate problems, they were building permanent installations that could support their activities indefinitely. The most sophisticated examples of network architecture were found in buildings that served multiple functions simultaneously. These structures appeared to be normal colonial businesses or residences, but actually contained hidden facilities for intelligence gathering, people transportation, financial operations, and communication coordination. They had created the colonial equivalent of modern integrated intelligence facilities. But the architectural discoveries raised disturbing questions about how extensively the network had penetrated colonial society. If their building techniques were this sophisticated and this widespread, what other aspects of colonial infrastructure had been designed to serve their purposes? The answer would be found in analyzing colonial urban planning itself, which revealed that entire sections of major colonial cities had been laid out according to the network's operational requirements. The most shocking discovery was that some of the most important buildings in colonial America, including several that became crucial sites during the American Revolution, had been designed with hidden features that served the network's purposes. The architecture of American independence had literally been built on foundations created by these women. But the architectural secrets were just the physical manifestation of something much more disturbing. The network had documented evidence that colonial urban planning itself was being influenced by British intelligence operations, and American cities were being designed to facilitate surveillance and control of the colonial population. The birth record was buried in the back pages of Boston's Trinity Church Registry for March 1694, written in faded ink that had nearly disappeared with age. Child born to Martha Hartwell, father unknown, baptized Mary Hartwell. But when genealogist Patricia Whitman cross-referenced this entry with other colonial records in 1994, she discovered something that challenged everything historians thought they knew about colonial family structures. Mary Hartwell had been raised by the Mather family as their adopted daughter. She had received the finest education available to colonial women, married into the prominent Wheelwright family, and her descendants had become some of New England's most respected citizens. What Patricia discovered was that Mary Hartwell wasn't unique. She was part of a systematic program that had placed hundreds of children born to network women into the most prominent families in colonial America. The coded records found in Martha Hartwell's hidden chamber contained detailed documentation of what she called the protection program. This wasn't random child abandonment or informal adoption. It was a sophisticated system for ensuring that children born within the network received opportunities that would have been impossible if their origins were known. The program had operated with the cooperation of prominent colonial families who were either customers of the network or sympathetic to the women's situation. The placement records revealed the extraordinary scope of the program. Children were being placed not just with merchant families or local gentry, but with colonial governors, prominent ministers, successful attorneys, and even some of the wealthiest plantation owners. These weren't casual arrangements. They were carefully negotiated agreements that included financial support, education guarantees, and inheritance provisions that ensured the children's long-term security. Martha's records documented the psychological toll the program took on the mothers who participated in it. Letters between network women contained heartbreaking discussions of women who had given up children knowing they would never be able to acknowledge them publicly. Some mothers had arranged to work as servants in the households where their children were being raised, allowing them to maintain contact while concealing their relationship. The financial arrangements were remarkably sophisticated. Adoptive families received substantial payments to cover the costs of raising and educating the children, but the money was structured as trust funds that couldn't be traced back to the network. The payments continued through the children's educational years, and often included dowries for daughters or business investments for sons. The network had essentially created the first systematic child support system in American history. The educational outcomes were extraordinary. Children placed through the program received educational opportunities that far exceeded what was available to most colonial children, regardless of their family's social status. Many were sent to Harvard College, educated by private tutors, or provided with professional training that led to successful careers in law, medicine, commerce, or government service. What was most remarkable was how many of these children became prominent figures in colonial and early American history. Patricia's genealogical research revealed that several signers of the Declaration of Independence, numerous colonial political leaders, successful merchants who funded the revolution, and even some early government officials had family connections that traced back to the network's placement program. The placement system had created an invisible web of family connections that extended throughout colonial American society. Children who had been raised separately often married into families that had connections to other network-placed children, creating extended family relationships that spanned multiple generations. The network had essentially created a hidden aristocracy within colonial society. The most disturbing aspect of the program was how it had been used to influence colonial politics and society. Some placements were clearly strategic, designed to give the network influence within important families. Children placed with colonial governors grew up with access to political information. Those placed with prominent merchants learned about trade opportunities and financial strategies. Those raised by religious leaders gained insight into theological and social movements. The coded records contained evidence that some adult children of the program maintained secret contact with the network throughout their adult lives. They provided information about their adoptive families' activities, used their positions to protect network operations, and sometimes used their inherited wealth to financially support network activities. The program had created a generation of sleeper agents throughout colonial society. The psychological impact on the children themselves was complex and often traumatic. Those who learned about their origins as adults struggled with identity questions and loyalty conflicts. Some became fierce protectors of the network that had given them opportunities, while others felt betrayed by the deception that had shaped their entire lives. A few used their discoveries to expose and attack the network operations. The placement program also revealed the network's sophisticated understanding of genetics and heredity. Martha's records contained detailed family histories that tracked intelligence, physical characteristics, and personality traits through multiple generations. The network was conducting what amounted to selective breeding programs decades before such concepts were formally studied. The most heartbreaking stories in the records involved mothers who had multiple children placed in different families. Some women had given birth to children over periods of decades, placing each child as circumstances and opportunities allowed. These mothers had created scattered families throughout colonial America, with siblings who would never know each other existed. The program's success rate in terms of the children's life outcomes was remarkable. Follow-up records suggested that over 80% of placed children achieved social and economic status significantly higher than their birth circumstances would have predicted. The network had demonstrated that with adequate resources and careful planning, social mobility was possible even in colonial America's rigid class structure. The financial legacy of the program was substantial. Many of the children placed through the network eventually inherited wealth from their adoptive families, but they also maintained access to resources the network had accumulated. Some used this combined wealth to establish businesses, fund educational institutions, or support political causes that reflected values they had learned from both their adoptive families and their hidden origins. The program's most lasting impact was genetic. DNA analysis of colonial-era families has revealed that genetic material from the network women is distributed throughout some of America's most prominent family lines. The genetic legacy of Martha Hartwell and women like her runs through bloodlines that include U.S. presidents, Supreme Court justices, industrial leaders, and cultural figures who shaped American development. But the children's program was just one aspect of the network's long-term planning. The placement records contained references to financial trusts, political investments, and business ventures that were designed to provide resources and influence for future generations. The network hadn't just been operating in the present. They had been building infrastructure for descendants they would never meet. The most disturbing discovery was that some children placed through the program had eventually gained access to positions within the British colonial administration. The network had essentially infiltrated the highest levels of colonial government through children who had been raised by prominent families, but maintained secret loyalties to the organization that had arranged their placement. However, the children's program also revealed something that would have horrified both the network operators and the families who participated in it. British intelligence services had identified the program and were using it for their own surveillance purposes, monitoring the placed children to gather intelligence about their adoptive families and their influence within colonial society. The letter was written in Martha Hartwell's most complex cipher, addressed to the Council of Mothers, and dated September 1697. When decoded, it revealed the existence of a governing structure that had remained completely invisible to colonial authorities and historians for over 3 centuries. "The Providence matter requires council attention," Martha wrote. "Sister Rebecca's proposal for territorial expansion must be evaluated according to established protocols. Sister Delilah's intelligence regarding Charleston authorities suggests immediate intervention necessary." The Council of Mothers wasn't a casual association of women in similar circumstances. It was a formal governing body, with established procedures, territorial jurisdictions, and decision-making authority that extended throughout colonial America. The decoded documents revealed a sophisticated organizational structure that rivaled the complexity of colonial governments, while operating entirely outside legal recognition. The council consisted of 12 women, each representing different geographical regions and operational specialties. Martha Hartwell coordinated New England operations, Rebecca Morrison handled the Middle Atlantic region, and Delilah Washington managed Southern territories. But the other 9 members remained mysterious figures identified only by coded names: the Boston Mother, the Harbor Sister, the Mountain Guide, and others whose real identities were protected by multiple layers of encryption. The governing protocols were remarkably sophisticated. The council met annually in person at rotating locations, maintained regular correspondence through coded messages, and had developed voting procedures for major decisions that affected network operations. They had created what amounted to a shadow government that coordinated activities across thousands of miles of colonial territory. The council's authority extended beyond simple business coordination. They established operational standards that all network establishments were required to follow, mediated disputes between different regions, allocated resources for expansion into new territories, and maintained discipline within the organization. They had created a management system that ensured quality control and operational security across a vast and complex enterprise. The most remarkable aspect of the council's operations was their judicial system. When conflicts arose within the network, either between individual operators or between different establishments, the council served as a court of final appeal. Their records contained detailed case studies of disputes involving territorial boundaries, customer conflicts, employee grievances, and financial disagreements. The council's decisions were binding and were enforced through economic sanctions and social pressure. The council had also developed what amounted to a primitive social services system. They maintained funds to support women who were injured, ill, or too old to continue working. They provided educational opportunities for children within the network. They offered financial assistance for women who wanted to leave the network and establish legitimate businesses. They had created a support system that provided security and opportunities that were unavailable through any official colonial institution. The intelligence coordination managed by the council was particularly sophisticated. Each regional representative was responsible for gathering and analyzing information within their territory, but the council synthesized this intelligence to identify patterns and opportunities that affected the entire network. They had created what amounted to a continental intelligence analysis system that was more comprehensive than anything available to colonial governments. The council's long-term planning capabilities were extraordinary. Their records contained detailed strategic plans that anticipated political changes, economic developments, and social movements decades before they occurred. They had predicted the growing tensions between colonial and British interests, identified opportunities that would emerge from territorial expansion, and prepared contingency plans for various scenarios that might affect their operations. The financial management overseen by the council revealed the true scope of the network's economic impact. By 1700, the combined operations they coordinated were generating revenue that exceeded the gross domestic product of several smaller colonies. They had created one of colonial America's largest economic enterprises, while maintaining complete invisibility in official records. The council's educational initiatives were perhaps their most forward-thinking achievement. They had established informal schools that provided education for women within the network, teaching not just practical skills but also literacy, mathematics, and what would now be called business administration. These schools were producing women with educational attainments that exceeded what was available to most colonial men. The organizational culture the council had created was remarkably progressive for its time. They had established principles of gender equality, racial integration, and economic cooperation that wouldn't become mainstream American values until the 20th century. Within their organization, women held positions of authority based on competence rather than social status, and racial barriers that defined colonial society were largely ignored. The council's influence on colonial politics was exercised through carefully coordinated campaigns that used their intelligence networks and economic resources to support candidates and policies that served their interests. They had developed lobbying techniques that influenced colonial assemblies, gubernatorial appointments, and even some British parliamentary decisions affecting colonial policy. The most disturbing aspect of the council's operations was their manipulation of colonial religious institutions. They had developed techniques for influencing ministerial appointments, church policy decisions, and religious teaching that served their operational needs. Several prominent colonial religious leaders were either directly connected to the network or were being influenced by council operations without their knowledge. The council's security protocols were more sophisticated than anything developed by colonial governments. They had created counterintelligence systems that identified threats to their operations, developed techniques for compromising potential enemies, and maintained surveillance networks that monitored colonial law enforcement activities. They knew about official investigations before the investigators themselves understood what they were looking for. A succession planning managed by the council ensured continuity of operations across generations. They had identified and trained younger women who could assume leadership roles, established financial trusts that would support future operations, and created knowledge preservation systems that would allow the organization to survive the death or retirement of founding members. But the council's most closely guarded secret was their connection to similar organizations in other parts of the British Empire. The decoded correspondence contained references to sister councils in the Caribbean, London, and even India. The network wasn't just a colonial American phenomenon. It was part of an international organization that operated throughout the British colonial system. The implications were staggering. The Council of Mothers had created what amounted to the first international women's organization, with coordinated operations that spanned continents and influenced imperial policy at the highest levels. They had achieved political and economic influence that wouldn't be formally recognized for women until centuries later. But the Council's greatest achievement, and their most dangerous secret, was their systematic documentation of corruption throughout the British colonial system. They had created detailed records of illegal activities, unauthorized transactions, and systematic abuse of power that went from colonial governors all the way to officials in London. This documentation would eventually become the foundation for understanding the true nature of British imperial administration in America. The council hadn't just been operating businesses or providing services. They had been conducting a comprehensive audit of colonial government that revealed corruption so extensive it would have justified revolution decades before. The accusation came on a grey October morning in 1692 when young Mercy Williams pointed her finger at Sarah Bishop and declared, "She came to me in the night as a spectre, trying to force me to sign the devil's book." But what Sarah Bishop knew, standing in Salem's courthouse facing a death sentence, was that her real crime had nothing to do with witchcraft. Her crime was knowing too much about the business dealings of Reverend Nicholas Noyes, the very minister who was now calling for her execution. Sarah Bishop wasn't a random victim of mass hysteria. She was a targeted elimination ordered by men who couldn't afford to let her secrets become public. The decoded records from Martha Hartwell's network revealed that at least 37 of the women executed during the Salem witch trials had direct connections to intelligence networks that operated throughout New England. They hadn't been killed for practicing witchcraft. They had been killed for possessing information that threatened the economic and political interests of colonial leaders. The connection became clear when Dr. Sarah Mitchell cross-referenced the list of accused witches with the decoded membership records from various network establishments. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. Women who had access to sensitive information about prominent men were being systematically eliminated through accusations of supernatural activity that colonial law treated as capital crimes. Sarah Bishop's case exemplified the pattern. She had worked at an establishment in Boston that catered to religious leaders, colonial officials, and successful merchants. Her encoded journal, discovered in 1994 during renovation of a Salem house, contained detailed records of conversations that revealed illegal business practices, political corruption, and personal scandals involving some of Massachusetts' most prominent citizens. The journal documented Reverend Noyce's involvement in illegal land speculation, fraudulent contracts with Native American tribes, and systematic embezzlement of church funds. Sarah had recorded specific dates, amounts, and participants in transactions that violated both colonial law and church doctrine. More dangerously, she had documented Noyce's role in manipulating witch trial proceedings to eliminate other people who possessed compromising information. The witch trials weren't random persecution driven by religious fanaticism. They were coordinated political assassinations disguised as supernatural investigations. The accusers weren't innocent children experiencing genuine spiritual torment. Many were being coached by adult conspirators who had identified specific targets for elimination. The trials weren't about fighting evil, they were about protecting criminal enterprises. Martha Hartwell's correspondence with other network operators contained explicit discussions of the political nature of the accusations. Sister Sarah's situation confirms our worst fears, she wrote to Rebecca Morrison in September. The Boston interests have found a method for eliminating convenient witnesses that requires no legal evidence or judicial oversight. We must assume all documented knowledge now represents mortal danger. The systematic nature of the targeting became apparent when Dr. Mitchell analyzed the geographical distribution of accusations. Women connected to the intelligence networks were being accused in multiple communities simultaneously, suggesting coordinated planning rather than spontaneous popular hysteria. The accusers were identifying targets based on information that could only have come from detailed knowledge of network operations. The most disturbing revelation was how legitimate colonial authorities had become complicit in the elimination program. Magistrates who normally required substantial evidence for criminal prosecutions were accepting accusations based entirely on spectral evidence. Claims that the accused had appeared as supernatural apparitions. This evidentiary standard was so low that it essentially eliminated any meaningful legal protection for the accused. Governor William Phipps's role in the witch trials took on sinister implications when viewed through the lens of network intelligence. Phipps had been receiving information from Martha Hartwell's network for years, but he had also been receiving reports about what information other women in the network possessed. When he allowed the witch trials to proceed, he was essentially authorizing the elimination of women who could expose his own illegal activities. The trial records themselves revealed the political nature of many accusations. Women were being accused of supernatural activities that corresponded suspiciously to their actual intelligence-gathering activities. Sarah Bishop was accused of appearing in spectral form to gather information about her accuser's private activities, which was exactly what she had been doing through entirely natural means while working in Boston establishments. The financial motivation behind many accusations became apparent when Dr. Mitchell analyzed property transfers following witch trial executions. Land and property belonging to executed women was typically seized by colonial authorities and sold to buyers who had connections to the accusers or their supporters. The witch trials had become a method for redistributing wealth from women who possessed dangerous information to men who wanted to eliminate them. The most horrific aspect of the witch trial connection was how it had been used to eliminate an entire generation of women who had developed sophisticated understanding of colonial politics and economics. The network had essentially created a class of female intellectuals who understood governmental and commercial operations better than most colonial men. The witch trials had systematically destroyed this intellectual capital. The psychological impact on surviving network members was devastating. Women who had operated successfully for years suddenly found themselves living in terror of accusation. Many fled to other colonies or abandoned their operations entirely. The witch trials had effectively destroyed the intelligence networks that had taken decades to build and had provided crucial services to colonial society. The long-term political implications were equally significant. The elimination of these intelligence networks meant that colonial authorities lost access to information that had been crucial for effective governance. Military intelligence, economic analysis, and social monitoring all suffered when the networks were destroyed. Colonial America became less well informed about its own condition, precisely when it needed better information to navigate growing tensions with British authorities. The witch trials also revealed the extent to which colonial society depended on violence and intimidation to maintain its power structures. When legal and economic pressure wasn't sufficient to control women who had gained too much knowledge and influence, colonial authorities were willing to use accusations of supernatural activity to justify state-sanctioned murder. But the most disturbing discovery was that the witch trial model had been exported to other colonies as a method for eliminating political threats. Similar patterns of accusations targeting women with access to sensitive information appeared in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. The witch trials weren't a regional aberration. They were a systematic technique for maintaining political control through targeted assassination. The decoded records also revealed that some women in the networks had anticipated the witch trial strategy and had developed countermeasures. They had created false documentation that could be used to discredit accusers, established escape routes for women who were likely to be targeted, and developed communication systems that could warn potential victims before accusations were filed. However, the witch trials served another purpose that even the network women hadn't fully understood. They were being used by British intelligence services to eliminate colonial sources of information that might be used against imperial interests. The trials weren't just about local political control, they were about imperial security, and the women who died were casualties in a broader conflict between colonial and British interests. The British officer was drunk, which was exactly what Rebecca Morrison had been counting on when she served him the third bottle of her finest imported wine. It was February 1775, and Captain Harold Westfield had arrived in Philadelphia with sealed orders from General Thomas Gage regarding troop movements that could determine the outcome of growing colonial unrest. What Captain Westfield didn't know was that every word he slurred would be transcribed, coded, and transmitted to colonial intelligence networks before he sobered up. "The fool thinks he'll surprise them at Lexington," Westfield mumbled, spilling wine on the detailed maps he had spread across Rebecca's private parlor table. "Doesn't realize we've been watching their ammunition stores for months." April 19th. Before dawn, that's when we move on Concord. Rebecca nodded sympathetically while memorizing every detail of information that would change the course of American history. The intelligence networks that had survived the witch trials had evolved into the most sophisticated espionage operation in colonial America. By 1775, establishments in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston maintained systematic intelligence gathering that provided colonial revolutionaries with detailed information about British military plans, political strategies, and economic policies. The networks had become America's first organized intelligence service decades before the Continental Congress created official spy operations. Rebecca's Philadelphia operation had become the primary intelligence hub for the Middle Atlantic region. Her establishment entertained British officers, colonial administrators, and loyalist merchants who discussed sensitive information while believing they were in secure, discreet environments. What they didn't realize was that every conversation was being monitored, recorded, and analyzed by women who understood the political implications of military and economic intelligence. The coded correspondence between Rebecca and surviving network operators revealed the extent of their intelligence contributions to the revolutionary cause. They had documented British troop movements, identified loyalist sympathizers within colonial communities, tracked supply shipments and ammunition stores, and provided advance warning of British military operations. Their intelligence was more accurate and timely than anything available through official colonial channels. Martha Hartwell's daughter, Mary Wheelwright, had inherited her mother's intelligence network and her coding skills. Operating from Boston under cover of running a respectable boarding house, Mary coordinated intelligence gathering that provided crucial information to Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and other revolutionary leaders. Her establishment was located strategically near British headquarters, allowing her to monitor official activities while appearing to run a legitimate business. The intelligence provided by the networks had direct impact on major revolutionary events. The advance warning about British plans to seize colonial ammunition stores allowed revolutionary leaders to relocate supplies before British raids. Information about British troop movements enabled colonial forces to avoid unfavourable engagements while positioning themselves for strategic advantages. Intelligence about British naval operations helped colonial merchants avoid capture while running supplies to revolutionary forces. The network's financial contributions to the revolutionary cause were equally significant. They had accumulated substantial capital over decades of operation, and much of this wealth was contributed to support colonial military operations. They funded weapons purchases, supplied provisions for colonial troops, and provided financial support for families of men who were serving in revolutionary forces. Their economic contributions were substantial enough to significantly impact the colonial war effort. The intelligence networks also played crucial roles in psychological warfare against British forces. They spread information designed to damage British morale, promoted propaganda that encouraged desertions from British units, and created confusion about colonial military capabilities that influenced British strategic planning. They had essentially become revolutionary propaganda operations that operated through intimate psychological manipulation. The most remarkable aspect of their revolutionary activities was how they maintained operational security while providing intelligence to colonial forces. They had developed communication systems that allowed them to pass information to revolutionary leaders without compromising their cover identities or exposing their intelligence sources. British authorities never realized that some of their most trusted establishments were actually revolutionary intelligence operations. The network's influence extended beyond simple intelligence gathering to actual political organizing. Women in the establishments were coordinating with revolutionary groups, facilitating communication between different colonial regions, and helping to organize resistance activities that required coordination across multiple communities. They had become crucial elements in the infrastructure of colonial revolution. The British eventually began to suspect that their intelligence was being compromised, but they never identified the source of the leaks. Colonial authorities investigating security breaches focused on obvious suspects like tavern keepers, postal workers, and known revolutionary sympathizers. They never considered that their most sensitive information was being gathered by women they visited for recreation rather than politics. The network's contribution to revolutionary success was so significant that several major revolutionary leaders maintained direct communication with network operators throughout the war. Paul Revere's famous Midnight Ride was successful, partly because he had advance intelligence about British movements that had been gathered through network sources. George Washington's intelligence operations relied heavily on information provided by women who had access to British officers through network establishments. The most dangerous aspect of the network's revolutionary activities was their infiltration of British military and political leadership. They had gained access to information from some of the highest-ranking British officials in America, including governors, military commanders, and intelligence officers. The scope of their penetration into British operations was so extensive that they essentially had real-time access to British strategic planning. The networks also played crucial roles in sustaining revolutionary morale during difficult periods of the war. They provided safe houses for revolutionary leaders who were being pursued by British forces, maintained communication channels when official systems were compromised, and used their intelligence capabilities to provide early warning of British operations that threatened revolutionary leaders or strategic assets. But perhaps their most important contribution was psychological. The networks demonstrated that British authority could be systematically undermined through organized resistance that operated beneath the level of official attention. They proved that apparently powerless people could gain significant influence through superior intelligence and careful organization. They had provided a model for resistance that influenced revolutionary thinking about how to challenge established authority. The intelligence networks had essentially become the invisible foundation of American independence. Their contributions to revolutionary success were substantial enough that the outcome of the war might have been different without their intelligence, financial support, and organizational capabilities. Yet their role remained completely hidden from historical records because acknowledging their contributions would have required acknowledging their existence. The most ironic aspect of their revolutionary service was that it ultimately led to their destruction. The new American government that emerged from the revolution was determined to establish moral legitimacy that required eliminating institutions that contradicted respectable social values. The networks that had helped create American independence became inconvenient reminders of the moral compromises that independence had required. However, the intelligence networks had documented their revolutionary contributions in coded records that provided detailed evidence of their service to American independence. These records would eventually reveal that America's founding fathers had depended heavily on intelligence gathered by women whose existence they could never publicly acknowledge. Elizabeth Hartwell Washington stood before the Philadelphia Board of Trade in March 1785, presenting a business proposal that would have been impossible for any woman to make just a decade earlier. She was requesting authorization to establish a maritime trading company with operations extending from Boston to Charleston, capitalized at £50,000, an enormous sum that exceeded the resources of most established male merchants. What the board members didn't know was that Elizabeth had learned business management from her mother, Martha Hartwell, and had inherited both capital and commercial expertise from America's most successful hidden economy. The transition from covert operations to legitimate business was neither simple nor automatic. The end of the Revolutionary War had created new opportunities for women to engage in legal commerce, but it had also eliminated the protection that network operations had provided during the colonial period. Women who had operated successfully in the shadow economy now had to navigate legitimate business structures that were designed to exclude female participation. Elizabeth's success represented the triumph of superior business training over legal discrimination. She had grown up learning sophisticated accounting methods, international trade practices, and customer relations techniques that were more advanced than anything taught in American colleges. Her mother's network had essentially operated as a business school that produced graduates with practical commercial education that surpassed formal training available to men. The maritime trading company Elizabeth established became one of Philadelphia's most successful commercial enterprises within 5 years of its founding. She had applied network principles to legitimate trade, superior intelligence gathering to identify market opportunities, relationship management to build customer loyalty, and financial analysis to optimize profit margins. Her business achieved success rates that impressed established merchants who couldn't understand how a woman could outperform experienced male traders. Rebecca Morrison's daughter, Sarah Morrison Franklin, had established a successful banking operation in New York that provided financial services to merchant families throughout the region. She had inherited her mother's understanding of credit systems, risk assessment, and international finance, allowing her to offer services that competing banks couldn't match. Her financial institution became so successful that it attracted customers from Boston to Charleston, who preferred her management to established banking houses. The transformation wasn't limited to individual success stories. Throughout the former colonies, women who had participated in network operations were establishing legitimate businesses that collectively represented a significant portion of early American commercial development. They were opening retail establishments, manufacturing operations, import-export companies, and service businesses that provided employment for hundreds of people and generated substantial tax revenue for the new state governments. The business practices these women had learned in network operations proved remarkably applicable to legitimate commerce. They understood customer psychology, market analysis, inventory management, and profit optimization in ways that gave them competitive advantages over traditionally trained merchants. Their businesses consistently achieved higher profit margins and customer satisfaction than comparable operations managed by men. The financial resources they had accumulated during network operations provided startup capital that allowed them to establish substantial businesses immediately, rather than growing slowly from small beginnings. Many were able to open with sufficient inventory, proper facilities, and adequate working capital to compete effectively with established businesses from their first day of operation. The network connections that had facilitated covert operations became valuable business networks that provided suppliers, customers, and partners for legitimate enterprises. Women who had cooperated in intelligence gathering and people transportation now cooperated in commercial ventures that created business opportunities throughout the former colonies. They had essentially created the first women's business network in American history. The education that network operations had provided proved invaluable for legitimate business management. These women understood international markets, currency exchange, business law, and commercial negotiation in ways that exceeded the preparation of most male merchants. They had received practical business education that was more comprehensive than formal training available through any American institution. The most remarkable aspect of their business success was how they maintained the cooperative principles that had governed network operations while adapting to competitive market conditions. They continued to share information, provide mutual support, and coordinate activities in ways that benefited all participants while competing effectively with male-dominated businesses. Their success also demonstrated the economic impact of gender discrimination in early American commerce. These women consistently outperformed male competitors who had received formal business training and inherited established commercial connections. Their superior performance suggested that excluding women from legitimate business opportunities had significantly reduced American commercial efficiency during the colonial period. The businesses established by former network participants also provided employment opportunities for other women that hadn't previously existed in American commerce. They hired women for positions that required intelligence, education, and business judgment rather than limiting female employment to domestic service or manual labor. They had created career opportunities that allowed women to use intellectual capabilities that the broader economy ignored. The political implications of their business success were significant but largely unrecognized. These women had demonstrated that female participation in commerce could generate substantial economic benefits for the broader society, but their success was attributed to individual exceptional circumstances rather than evidence that gender discrimination was economically counterproductive. The most lasting impact of their entrepreneurial success was the business dynasties they established. Many of the companies founded by former network participants continued to operate for generations, creating family enterprises that provided economic security and social status for their descendants. Several became major corporations that played important roles in American industrial development. But their business success also created new vulnerabilities. As legitimate entrepreneurs, they were subject to economic competition, legal regulation, and social scrutiny that had been avoided during network operations. Some found that legitimate business was actually more challenging than covert operations, because it required conforming to social expectations that limited their operational flexibility. The most ironic aspect of their entrepreneurial transformation was that their business success eventually contributed to historical amnesia about their network origins. As respectable businesswomen, they had incentives to conceal their previous activities, and their descendants preferred family histories that emphasized legitimate commercial achievement rather than network participation. However, the business records they maintained as legitimate entrepreneurs contained coded references and financial connections that preserved evidence of their network origins. These records would eventually provide crucial documentation for historians attempting to understand the economic transition from colonial to early American commerce. The true measure of their entrepreneurial impact was that several major American fortunes that were attributed to male business genius were actually founded on capital and expertise that had been accumulated by women through network operations. The invisible foundation of American capitalism included resources and knowledge that had been developed by women whose contributions were systematically erased from historical memory. The letter arrived at Mount Vernon on a crisp December morning in 1789, written in elegant script on expensive paper that bore no identifying marks. "Your Excellency," it began, "the principles of reinvention and redemption that guided our recent struggle for independence were not born in the halls of Congress or the fields of battle. They emerged from the experiences of people who learned that survival sometimes requires becoming someone new, that past mistakes need not determine future possibilities, and that individual liberty means the right to recreate oneself according to personal vision rather than social expectation." George Washington never responded to this anonymous letter, but he kept it in his private papers until his death. The letter had been written by Mary Wheelwright, Martha Hartwell's daughter, and it articulated something that Washington and other founding fathers had unconsciously absorbed from American colonial culture: the notion that identity was fluid, that social status could be earned rather than inherited, and that moral redemption was always possible for those willing to work for it. These ideas hadn't emerged from European philosophical traditions or classical Republican theory. They had developed from the practical experiences of people who had been forced to reinvent themselves to survive in colonial America. And many of those people had been connected to the intelligence networks that had operated throughout the colonies. The cultural values that would become distinctively American had been shaped by women whose existence was systematically erased from historical records. The concept of the self-made man that would become central to American mythology had originated in the experiences of people who had literally made themselves over to escape impossible circumstances. The networks had provided models for personal transformation that influenced broader colonial culture, even when the specific source of these models remained hidden. Americans learned to believe in second chances because they had witnessed systematic second chance creation in operation throughout their communities. The American emphasis on entrepreneurship and business innovation had been shaped by network operations that demonstrated how intelligent people could create economic opportunities that didn't officially exist. The networks had pioneered business practices, developed innovative services, and created market opportunities that provided models for legitimate commerce. American business culture had absorbed lessons from enterprises that couldn't be acknowledged, but couldn't be ignored. The distinctively American attitude toward authority, skeptical, questioning, and resistant to arbitrary power, had been influenced by network experiences that revealed the hypocrisy and corruption of supposedly legitimate institutions. Americans learned to distrust official authority partly because network operations had documented systematic abuse of power by colonial leaders. The revolutionary skepticism toward government authority had been informed by intelligence that revealed how much official authority was actually illegitimate. The American belief in social mobility and the possibility of changing one's circumstances had been demonstrated by network operations that lifted people from desperate situations to positions of influence and prosperity. The networks had provided concrete examples of how intelligent effort could overcome legal barriers and social restrictions. Americans believed in opportunity partly because they had witnessed opportunity creation, even under the most restrictive circumstances. The American concept of privacy and individual rights had been influenced by network experiences that demonstrated the importance of protecting personal information and maintaining operational security. The networks had developed sophisticated techniques for preserving individual privacy while engaging in community activities, providing models for balancing personal autonomy with social cooperation. The American emphasis on personal liberty had been shaped by people who understood liberty as something that had to be actively protected rather than passively enjoyed. The distinctively American approach to problem-solving, practical, innovative, and willing to ignore traditional restrictions, had been influenced by network methods that focused on achieving results rather than following established procedures. The networks had demonstrated that creative solutions could overcome apparently impossible obstacles if people were willing to think beyond conventional limitations. American ingenuity had been shaped by examples of people who had solved problems that officially couldn't be solved. The American belief in equality and democratic participation had been influenced by network operations that treated people according to their abilities rather than their official social status. The networks had provided examples of integrated cooperation that ignored racial, class, and gender barriers that defined colonial society. Americans learned to believe in equality, partly because they had witnessed successful egalitarian communities, even if those communities remained officially invisible. The American emphasis on education and self-improvement had been shaped by network investments in knowledge and skill development that demonstrated the practical value of learning. The networks had created educational opportunities that exceeded what was available through official institutions, showing that intellectual development could provide security and advancement that traditional social structures denied. Americans believed in education partly because they had seen education transform lives in dramatic ways. The distinctively American concept of success, measured by personal achievement rather than inherited status, had been influenced by network examples of people who had gained wealth, influence, and respect through their own efforts, rather than family connections. The networks had demonstrated that merit could overcome social disadvantages if people were willing to work intelligently and persistently. American meritocracy had been shaped by examples of people who had earned advancement through performance, rather than privilege. The American attitude toward moral questions, pragmatic, flexible, and focused on outcomes rather than abstract principles, had been influenced by network experiences that required balancing competing moral claims while achieving practical results. The networks had dealt with situations where conventional morality provided no useful guidance, developing ethical frameworks that prioritized human welfare over theoretical consistency. American moral pragmatism had been shaped by people who had learned to make difficult choices without perfect moral guidance. The most profound cultural impact was the American belief that society could be improved through individual action and voluntary cooperation. The networks had demonstrated that small groups of committed people could create significant social change without official authorization or institutional support. Americans learned to believe in grassroots organizing and voluntary association partly because they had witnessed the effectiveness of informal cooperation in achieving substantial results. The psychological impact was equally significant. Americans developed cultural tolerance for complexity, ambiguity, and moral uncertainty, that distinguished them from European societies that maintained clearer social categories and moral boundaries. The networks had contributed to a cultural sophistication that acknowledged the gap between public appearances and private realities, while maintaining functionality in both spheres. But the most lasting cultural contribution was the American capacity for reinvention and renewal. The networks had demonstrated that societies could transform themselves by acknowledging uncomfortable truths, adapting to changing circumstances, and creating new opportunities for people who had been excluded from traditional structures. This capacity for cultural regeneration would become America's greatest strength during periods of crisis and change. The cultural DNA that the networks had contributed to American society would prove crucial during major historical challenges: the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, and other national crises would be met with responses that drew on cultural resources that had been developed by people whose contributions remained officially invisible. However, this cultural inheritance also included darker elements: comfort with systematic deception, tolerance for institutional hypocrisy, and acceptance of invisible power structures that operated beyond democratic accountability. The networks had created cultural patterns that could support both positive social innovation and dangerous manipulation of democratic processes. The directive arrived at Harvard College on official Massachusetts letterhead, bearing the seal of Governor John Hancock, and dated March 5. The Commonwealth requires immediate review and revision of all historical documents in the college's possession to ensure compliance with moral standards appropriate for the education of virtuous Jesuits in our new republic, the order stated. What followed was the most comprehensive historical falsification project in American history. Professor Jonathan Sewell, appointed as Harvard's first official historian, understood that his mission wasn't scholarship, it was propaganda. Over the next decade, Sewell supervised the systematic alteration of colonial records, family histories, and institutional documents to create a sanitized version of American origins that eliminated evidence of the intelligence networks, their economic operations, and their influence on colonial development. The project's scope was staggering. Every major educational institution in the former colonies received similar directives, coordinated through unofficial channels, to ensure consistency in the revised historical narrative. Yale College, the College of William and Mary, Princeton, and smaller institutions all participated in what amounted to a coordinated campaign to rewrite American history before it could be properly recorded. The methodology was sophisticated and thorough. Rather than simply destroying inconvenient documents, the revisers created elaborate replacement narratives that filled gaps left by removed evidence. They didn't just eliminate references to network operations, they created fictional explanations for economic development, political events, and social changes that had actually been influenced by network activities. The Hartwell family papers provided a case study in systematic historical falsification. Martha Hartwell's business records were replaced with fictional documents showing her as a seamstress who had supported her family through modest needlework. Her correspondence with network operators throughout the colonies was replaced with letters discussing domestic concerns and religious observations. Her intelligence-gathering activities were completely eliminated from family records. Even her physical description was altered in documents. The original records described Martha as an educated woman who read multiple languages and maintained extensive correspondence with people throughout the colonies. The revised documents portrayed her as a simple domestic worker whose concerns never extended beyond her immediate household. The historical revision had transformed a sophisticated intelligence coordinator into a generic colonial housewife. The revision extended beyond individual families to entire categories of historical evidence. Colonial tax records were systematically altered to eliminate revenue streams that couldn't be explained without acknowledging network operations. Trade statistics were modified to hide commercial activities that had generated substantial colonial wealth. Population records were adjusted to eliminate evidence of establishments that officially never existed. The most sophisticated aspect of the revision was how it created false documentation to support the sanitized narrative. Colonial authorities commissioned professional scribes to create backdated documents that provided evidence for fictional family histories. They employed craftsmen to age new documents so they would appear authentic to future historians. They even created false archaeological evidence by burying manufactured artifacts that supported revised stories about colonial life. Churches played crucial roles in the historical revision campaign. Religious institutions throughout the former colonies participated in rewriting baptismal records, marriage certificates, and burial registers to conform to the sanitized narrative. They altered membership rolls to eliminate evidence of people who had been connected to network operations. They even rewrote theological documents to remove references to moral complexities that the new narrative couldn't accommodate. Legal institutions were equally complicit in the falsification project. Court records were systematically edited to remove cases that revealed network operations or government corruption. Wills and estate documents were altered to hide the sources of substantial inheritances. Property transfer records were modified to create fictional ownership histories that eliminated inconvenient connections. The financial resources devoted to the revision project were enormous. State governments allocated substantial funds for what they euphemistically called historical preservation, but the money was actually used to pay for document alteration, false documentation creation, and coordination between different institutions. Private families contributed additional resources to ensure that their own histories were properly sanitized. The psychological impact on people who had lived through the colonial period was devastating. They were forced to watch as their actual experiences were replaced with fictional narratives that bore no resemblance to historical reality. Older Americans found themselves living in a society that had collectively decided to forget its own past and replace it with comfortable myths. The revision project also required eliminating physical evidence that contradicted the sanitized narrative. Buildings that had housed network operations were demolished or extensively modified to remove architectural features that suggested their actual purposes. Artifacts that provided evidence of network activities were destroyed or hidden in private collections. Even gravestones were replaced to conform to revised family histories. The educational impact was profound and lasting. The generation of Americans who grew up after the revision learned a version of colonial history that was almost entirely fictional. They were taught that colonial America had been a morally pure society where virtuous families had prospered through honest labor and religious devotion. The complex realities of colonial economic and political development were replaced with simplistic narratives about moral progress and divine providence. The international implications were equally significant. European observers who studied American society were presented with historical documentation that portrayed colonial development as uniquely virtuous and democratic. This false documentation contributed to international perceptions of American exceptionalism that were based on systematic historical deception rather than actual American achievements. The most tragic aspect of the revision project was its impact on women's history. The systematic elimination of evidence about network operations destroyed documentation of sophisticated female intellectual achievement, business innovation, and political influence that wouldn't be equaled by officially recognized women for over a century. The revision had erased evidence of female capabilities that contradicted prevailing assumptions about gender roles. The project's success was so complete that by 1820, most Americans genuinely believed the sanitized version of their history. The people who had participated in network operations were dying off, and their children had been raised on fictional family histories that eliminated uncomfortable truths about their origins. American society had successfully convinced itself that its colonial past had been morally pure, but complete historical erasure proved impossible despite the project's comprehensiveness. Some evidence survived in unexpected locations, hidden chambers in old buildings, private family collections that escaped official review, and coded documents that weren't recognized as historically significant. The truth remained buried but not entirely destroyed. The most ironic consequence of the Great Cover-Up was that it preserved evidence of its own existence. The documents authorizing historical revision, the correspondence coordinating falsification activities, and the financial records showing payments for document alteration all became historical evidence themselves. Future historians would eventually use the cover-up documentation to understand both what had been hidden and why it had been necessary to hide it. The revision project had achieved its immediate political goals. It had created a foundation myth that supported American claims to moral superiority and democratic legitimacy, but it had also created a fundamental dishonesty in American historical consciousness that would complicate the nation's ability to understand its own development and learn from its actual experiences. The Great Cover-Up would eventually be recognized as one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history, but its success came at the cost of genuine historical understanding that might have provided valuable guidance for addressing future challenges. The ground-penetrating radar had been mapping colonial Boston for 3 months, when technician Maria Santos noticed an anomaly beneath what had been Fish Street in 1690. The readings showed a complex of chambers and tunnels that didn't correspond to any known colonial construction. It was September 2018, and Santos was working on a city planning project to update Boston's utility infrastructure. She had no idea she was about to uncover physical evidence that would revolutionize understanding of colonial American history. The archaeological excavation that followed revealed a sophisticated underground facility that had remained sealed since the early 18th century. The chambers contained furniture, documents, personal belongings, and business equipment that provided unprecedented insight into the daily operations of Martha Hartwell's intelligence network. For the first time, historians could examine the physical environment where colonial America's most influential hidden economy had actually operated. The discovery triggered a wave of similar investigations throughout the former colonies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of colonial sites in Philadelphia, Charleston, Newport, and New York began revealing hidden chambers, secret passages, and buried documentation that had escaped the great cover-up of the early 19th century. Each site provided additional evidence of the network's existence and sophistication. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the MIT archaeologist who coordinated the Boston excavation, realized that modern technology was finally making it possible to uncover evidence that had been successfully hidden for over 3 centuries. "We're not just finding artifacts," she explained to the media. "We're discovering that colonial American society was fundamentally different from what we've been taught. These women created institutions that were more sophisticated than anything in the official historical record." The DNA analysis capabilities that became available in the 2010s provided another breakthrough in understanding network operations. Genetic material recovered from the sealed chambers could be compared with samples from descendants of prominent colonial families, revealing family connections that had been eliminated from all historical records. The results confirmed that genetic material from network women was distributed throughout some of America's most prominent bloodlines. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins who specialized in historical DNA analysis, discovered that several U.S. presidents, Supreme Court justices, and major industrial leaders had genetic markers that traced back to women who had participated in colonial intelligence networks. The genetic evidence proves that these networks had lasting impact on American development through family lines that were never officially acknowledged, she reported. The digital analysis of colonial documents using artificial intelligence provided yet another tool for uncovering hidden evidence. AI systems could analyze thousands of documents simultaneously, identifying patterns in handwriting, linguistic usage, and numerical coding that revealed connections between apparently unrelated colonial records. Computer analysis was uncovering evidence that human historians had missed for centuries. The AI analysis revealed that network coding systems had been more sophisticated and more widely used than anyone had realized. Hidden messages appeared in official government documents, church records, and family correspondence throughout the colonial period. The networks had essentially created a parallel communication system that operated within legitimate colonial institutions without detection. Archaeological investigation of colonial buildings using modern techniques revealed architectural features that had been missed by previous historians. Thermal imaging showed sealed chambers behind walls. Ultrasonic analysis revealed hidden passages between buildings, and chemical analysis of building materials provided evidence of construction modifications that had concealed network operations. The most remarkable discovery came during restoration of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where hidden chambers were found directly beneath the room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. The chambers contained documents suggesting that intelligence gathered by network operations had influenced some of the political decisions that led to American independence. International cooperation among historians began revealing that similar networks had operated throughout the British Empire. Researchers in London, Kingston, and Calcutta found evidence of intelligence operations that had coordinated with American networks, suggesting that the colonial American phenomenon was part of a much larger imperial pattern of hidden economic and political activity. The discoveries also attracted negative attention from groups that preferred traditional narratives about American origins. Some historians, political leaders, and religious organizations argued that focusing on these networks was unpatriotic and undermined important cultural values. The discoveries had become politically controversial in ways that complicated scholarly investigation, but the evidence continued to accumulate despite political resistance. Each new archaeological site, each decoded document, and each genetic analysis provided additional confirmation of the network's existence and influence. The cumulative weight of evidence was making it impossible to maintain the sanitized version of colonial history that had been created during the early 19th century. The most significant recent discovery came in 2019 when construction workers renovating a colonial mansion in Providence found a sealed room that contained what appeared to be Martha Hartwell's complete archives. The room had been designed as a time capsule, with documents preserved in conditions that allowed for detailed analysis using modern techniques. The Providence archives contained evidence that the networks had documented their own activities with the expectation that future generations would eventually uncover the truth. Martha Hartwell and other network leaders had understood that their historical erasure was temporary and had preserved evidence for historians who would have the tools and perspective necessary to understand their contributions to American development. The digital preservation of discovered documents was creating comprehensive databases that allowed researchers throughout the world to analyze network operations from multiple perspectives. Online archives were making it possible for scholars to collaborate on decoding projects that required expertise in cryptography, linguistics, history, and psychology. The most recent breakthrough came with the development of chemical analysis techniques that could reveal invisible ink and detect document alterations that weren't apparent to visual inspection. These techniques were uncovering hidden layers of information in documents that had been examined by historians for decades. But perhaps the most important recent discovery was the realization that network documentation was still being found in private family collections, historical societies, and institutional archives throughout America. The networks had been so extensive and their documentation so comprehensive that complete evidence of their operations could never be entirely eliminated. The ongoing discoveries were forcing a fundamental reconsideration of American colonial history and its influence on national development. The networks represented sophisticated institutions that had operated successfully for over a century while remaining completely invisible in official historical records. Their rediscovery was revealing that American society had been shaped by forces and influences that hadn't been acknowledged or understood. The implications extended beyond historical scholarship to contemporary understanding of American culture, politics, and social development. The networks had contributed to distinctively American values and institutions in ways that could only be appreciated once their existence and influence were properly documented and analyzed. However, the discoveries also raised disturbing questions about what other aspects of American history might have been systematically concealed or falsified. If networks this extensive and influential could remain hidden for centuries, what other hidden forces might have shaped American development without official recognition or historical acknowledgement? The congressional hearing room fell silent as Dr. Jennifer Walsh placed the decoded document on the witness table. It was March 2021, and the House Subcommittee on Historical Accuracy had convened to address growing controversy over revelations about colonial American intelligence networks. The document Walsh had presented was Martha Hartwell's final letter, dated December 1698, which contained her assessment of what future Americans would need to understand about their origins. "We built the foundation you inherited," Martha had written in her complex cipher. "We created the economy that financed your independence, the intelligence networks that protected your revolution, and the cultural values that shaped your democracy. We did this while being systematically excluded from the society we were creating. Future generations will judge whether this contradiction can be reconciled with your claims to moral superiority." The reckoning that Martha had predicted was finally beginning. 3 centuries after the networks had been erased from historical records, American society was being forced to confront the gap between its founding mythology and its actual historical development. The discoveries were raising fundamental questions about American identity, moral authority, and the stories societies tell themselves about their origins. The political implications were immediate and divisive. Conservative historians and political leaders argued that focusing on these networks was unpatriotic and undermined important cultural values that had sustained American democracy for over 2 centuries. They contended that mythologized history served important social functions that shouldn't be sacrificed for historical accuracy that served no constructive purpose. Progressive historians and political leaders argued that understanding the actual complexity of American origins was essential for addressing contemporary challenges related to gender equality, racial justice, and economic inequality. They contended that sanitized history prevented Americans from learning important lessons about their society's capacity for both positive change and systematic oppression. The religious implications were equally controversial. Many American churches had built theological narratives around the assumption that colonial America had been a morally pure society, where virtuous Christians had created institutions that reflected divine guidance. The network revelations challenged these narratives by revealing that colonial society had been shaped by people and activities that contradicted fundamental religious teachings. The educational implications were profound and practical. Textbooks, curricula, and teaching materials throughout American schools were based on historical narratives that had been systematically falsified during the early 19th century. Incorporating accurate information about network operations would require comprehensive revision of educational materials and teacher training programs. The cultural implications were perhaps most significant. The networks had contributed to distinctively American values: entrepreneurship, social mobility, individual reinvention, skepticism toward authority, but their contributions had been systematically concealed. Americans had inherited cultural traits from ancestors whose existence they had been taught to deny. The psychological implications were complex and troubling. American society had been based on collective amnesia about significant aspects of its own development. Citizens had been taught to identify with historical narratives that bore little resemblance to their ancestors' actual experiences. The recovery of accurate historical knowledge was forcing uncomfortable reconsideration of American self-understanding. The international implications were equally significant. American claims to exceptional moral authority in global affairs had been based partly on narratives about virtuous origins that were contradicted by the network revelations. Other nations were beginning to question American moral credibility, based on evidence of systematic historical deception. But the most profound implication was philosophical. The networks had demonstrated that complex societies could function successfully while maintaining fundamental contradictions between public values and actual practices. Colonial America had proclaimed moral purity while depending economically on activities that violated its stated principles. The society had learned to compartmentalize successfully enough to maintain both official virtue and practical compromise. This compartmentalization had become a defining characteristic of American culture. Americans had learned to maintain public commitment to idealistic principles, while privately accepting pragmatic compromises that violated those principles. The networks had contributed to a cultural sophistication that allowed simultaneous commitment to contradictory values without psychological breakdown. The network revelations also demonstrated the historical importance of invisible institutions and hidden economies. Significant aspects of social development had occurred outside official recognition, creating influences that shaped society without appearing in conventional historical records. The network suggested that understanding any society required investigating what remained hidden as well as what was officially acknowledged. The gender implications were revolutionary. The networks had demonstrated female intellectual, organizational, and entrepreneurial capabilities that exceeded officially recognized male achievements during the same period. Women had created sophisticated institutions, managed complex operations, and influenced major historical events while being systematically excluded from official acknowledgement. The revelation suggested that gender discrimination had reduced American social and economic efficiency for centuries. The economic implications were equally significant. The networks had generated substantial wealth, created employment opportunities, and contributed to colonial economic development in ways that hadn't been calculated in any economic analyses. American prosperity had been built partly on economic activities that were systematically excluded from official economic accounting. The moral implications were most challenging. The networks had emerged from social conditions that offered women virtually no legitimate alternatives for economic survival or social advancement. Their activities had been responses to systematic oppression rather than moral failures. Yet their operations had involved activities that violated important social values and had contributed to cultural patterns of deception and hypocrisy. The political implications extended beyond historical understanding to contemporary governance. The networks had demonstrated that democratic societies could be significantly influenced by hidden institutions that operated beyond public accountability. They had shown how intelligence gathering, economic manipulation, and political influence could be exercised without official recognition or democratic oversight. But perhaps the most important implication was inspirational. The networks had demonstrated that apparently powerless people could create institutions, influence major events, and shape historical development through intelligence, organization, and persistence. They had proven that social change could be achieved by people who were systematically excluded from official power structures. The reckoning that Martha Hartwell had predicted was forcing Americans to choose between comfortable myths and complex truths about their origins. The choice had implications that extended far beyond historical scholarship to fundamental questions about American identity, moral authority, and the stories democratic societies could tell themselves while maintaining both honesty and social cohesion. The networks had left a final challenge for their descendants: whether American society could acknowledge its actual complexity while maintaining the cultural values that had emerged from that complexity. The answer would determine whether Americans could learn from their hidden history, or would continue to be shaped by forces they refused to acknowledge. History whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen in the darkness. If you're ready to hear more forgotten truths that textbooks fear to tell, subscribe before these voices fade back into the shadows where they've waited for centuries to be heard again.